Good evening and good morning, and of course, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session 2, Cybersecurity session of the first World Emerging Security Forum, hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. And once again, it's my great honor to be your MC today. My name is Jessica Lee. Nice to meet you all. Thank you. So we are having the first World Emerging Security Forum for 2 consecutive days. Starting from yesterday, today, it's being held both online and offline with our renowned speakers from home and abroad to discuss the future direction of a multilateral cooperation in response to emerging security threats. And our forum is being live streamed on the official YouTube channel of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. So ladies and gentlemen, until the very end, please be with us. Thank you very much for your attendance and participation. So we started our forum yesterday with the opening ceremony and the session 1 on health security. And today, we will have a talk about the session 2, cybersecurity, and then session 3, emerging technologies and security. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, we'd like to begin the session 2 under the theme of international cooperation to realize a safe and peaceful cyberspace. We will discuss the necessity of multi-layered and integrated global governance based on trust among various actors, and together seek cooperative measures to protect the universal values in cyberspace, such as human rights, freedom of expression, and privacy as well. So on the session 2, we will have a total of 2 keynote speeches and a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session. For a keynote speech, we have 2 renowned speakers from abroad. First of all, Ambassador Jörg Lauber, Permanent Representative of Switzerland in Geneva, and we also have Mr. Vint Cerf, the Vice President of Google. Thank you once again. And a panel discussion will be chaired by Ms. Joyce Hakme, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House and co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. So thank you for your attendance today, and I'd like to pass over the microphone after our keynote session. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, for your information, all staff and our participants at the site have thoroughly completed precautionary measures in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. In addition, we ask for your understanding that we have installed a screen on the stage, so our panelists on the stage will not wear a mask while having a presentation. So please understand that as well. And during the session, those who are watching our forum online could leave your comments or questions in the comment box of our official YouTube channel. And those who are joining us here at the site, you can also turn in your questions and comments as well. So please refer to the QR code on your template or on your table as well. So we like to ask for your active participation until the very end, and we will try very hard to answer your inquiries and curiosity. So without further ado, let's have our first keynote speech. So the first keynote speech will be delivered by Ambassador Jörg Lauber, who is the permanent representative of Switzerland to the UN and the other international organizations in Geneva, and also the first chair of the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Developments in the Field of ICTs in the context of international security. So he's joining us in real time via Zoom. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica, dear colleagues, excellencies. Thank you very much for having me. Good morning from Geneva. I would, of course, have liked to be with you in Korea, where I served at the very beginning of my career 30 years ago exactly. And many good memories, but due to many circumstances, I have to do this via Zoom, but I'm really happy to be with you, at least in this way this morning. And it is a true privilege and a pleasure also for me to speak to you a bit about my experience with the Open-Ended Working Group. If it's okay with you, what I want to do is to give you a little bit of history of the Open-Ended Working Group, talk about the multi-stakeholder approach that we took through the process, then make some observations about the results, the outcomes of the Open-Ended Working Group, And last but not least, make a call for the continuation of international cooperation on the issue of cybersecurity, which is obviously very much the theme of your event. So on the open-ended working group, as Jessica kindly mentioned, I had the privilege to be the first chair or chair the first open-ended working group on developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. That was its official, slightly cumbersome name. As you know, this open-ended working group was indeed the first dedicated UN process on cybersecurity that was open to all 193 member states and other participants. That was a real breakthrough at this point. At the same time, it's important to remember that the UN, the United Nations, had been addressing the issue of ICT security a long time before. It started with the first General Assembly resolution in 1998. And then over the course of these many years since then, very important work had been done primarily by so-called groups of governmental experts. They were very small in numbers. I think they started out, the first group, with 15 members. And then there were 4 others up until number 5, and then the 6th in parallel to our open-ended working group. Up until 2015, these groups, these subsequent groups, were able to create an acquis of what we know today as an international framework of responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, consisting basically of 4 pillars. 1, a set of non-binding norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Number 2, a common understanding with regard to the application of existing international law. The 3rd pillar was confidence building measures, and the 4th pillar, measures on capacity building. Now, over the last 2 years, since 2019, the first open-ended working group and the number 6, the 6th GGE, were able, on the one hand, to reconfirm this acquis that had been built up until 2015, but also to advance it, and I'll come back to that. As you probably also know, a new open-ended working group that will pick up the work that we've done over the last 2 years has already been established and will begin its formal work very shortly. The move from GGE, a small group of government experts, to open-ended working group, open to all member states of the United Nations, was very significant. Among other things, I feel it underlines the importance, but also the urgency of today's cyber threat landscape. But it also shows the desire of all states to seek international cooperation to address this threat. So much for the background of the open-ended working groups. Now a few words on the multi-stakeholder approach. The new open-ended working group that has been established for the next 5 years will definitely be the key intergovernmental multilateral process on cybersecurity for some time to come. But at the same time, we see a multitude of joint initiatives of the private sector, civil society, academia, and governments, such as the Paris Call, the Tech Accord, or the Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace. In these processes, actors from different backgrounds are joining forces to advance international cybersecurity, all of them with the aspiration to maintain an open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace. These multi-stakeholders initiatives underline 2 key aspects of international cybersecurity. First, the nature of cyberspace as a shared space used and shaped by a variety of stakeholders. And as a consequence, second, the fact that all of us who use cyberspace are at risk of becoming victims of malicious cyber activities. When you look at the media or you read the newspapers, you watch TV, almost every day there are reports of cyber attacks hitting a whole variety of targets. So as I said earlier, the open-ended working group is an intergovernmental process. Nevertheless, it offered the opportunity, and I hope it will continue to do so, the opportunity to stakeholders from civil society, academia, and the private sector to contribute to cybersecurity discussions at the United Nations level. And it did so on an unprecedented level. A huge number of contributions from academia, civil society, private sector on our website, which is still up, although we finished our work, is proof of that. Now some observations from the outcome or on the outcome of the open-ended working group. In addition to the multi-stakeholder participation, the open-ended working group and the latest GGE benefited from their exchanges with regional organizations, such as the European Union, the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe, the Organization of American States, the African Union, ASEAN, and its dialogue partners. Through these meetings between the group and the regional organizations, the regional actors were able to add their particular experience and perspective to the discussions at global level. And for many member states, the open-ended working group was the first opportunity to engage in an institutional dialogue at the UN on the issue of cybersecurity. In this sense, the open-ended working group was an important learning experience for many to bring their delegation up to speed. It encouraged them, I believe, to develop their own positions and gain a comprehensive understanding on the one side of the challenges and the possible solutions, but also to learn about what had been done in the past, because not all the delegations were following very closely the work of these GGEs, although their reports were usually endorsed by the General Assembly. At the same time, the current developments such as COVID-19 pandemic and related trends in the use of technologies had their impact on the discussions of the open-ended working group. In our discussions, states noted the sharp increase in cybersecurity vulnerabilities as a consequence of the heavy reliance on digital technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic. They also noted the increase in cyber attacks against medical services and facilities. They emphasized the need for adequate protection of critical healthcare infrastructure from cyber attacks. And as a consequence of this discussion, the open-ended working group's report considers such medical infrastructures to be covered by the norm on the protection of critical infrastructure as part of the set of norms developed by previous GGEs. I refer to that as the acquis. Now, let me continue with a call for international cooperation. When the open-ended working group and the latest GGE began their work in 2019, very few experts, I believe, at that point were ready to bet on successful outcomes of either one of the two processes. Remember, no more consensus on the subject of cybersecurity had been achieved after 2015. 2015 was the last report of a GG being adopted by consensus. And geopolitics had not exactly improved between 2015 and 2019. Now, the fact that states were able to agree on two reports, the one of the open-ended working group and the GGE, two reports with practical recommendations on how to advance international cybersecurity, is, I believe, a reflection of the urgency of the issue at hand, but also the willingness of member states to compromise in the interest of practical solutions that may address the challenges in international cybersecurity. In other words, I think multilateralism proved its worth. Multilateralism really matters and is able to perform. The two reports and their recommendations now have to be implemented, of course. They are the basis for better international cooperation in cybersecurity, and they should accelerate our joint efforts to establish the necessary trust and security in order to fulfill the promise of an open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace. And I would very much, in this context, congratulate the Korean organizers of the World Emerging Security Forum. It is this kind of discussions, this kind of fora that are key in this endeavor to continue international cooperation on the issue. The international framework developed by the United Nations, or on United Nations level, by the GGs, by the open-ended working group, is a reflection of the need for international cooperation to address the challenges of international cybersecurity. The discussions of the open-ended working group showed in particular the need and the potential for cybersecurity capacity building. The report of the open-ended working group identifies cybersecurity capacity building as a two-way street, a reciprocal endeavor in which participants learn from each other and where all sides benefit from the general improvement to global ICT security. Remember, cybersecurity is only as strong as its weakest link. At the same time, I believe that international discussions on cybersecurity need to continue, even if some of the issues are very sensitive. The normative framework on responsible state behavior in cyberspace must be further developed where necessary and in order to keep up with new and emerging trends in the cyber threat landscape. We also need to discuss ways to improve implementation of existing norms, and we may also need to talk about how we deal with violations of norms. The outcome of the open-ended working group contains a chair summary reflecting various proposals and ideas introduced by states on which there was not yet achieved consensus, but which might serve as an inspiration for future discussions. As I mentioned before, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution last year establishing a new open-ended working group with a mandate from 2021 to 2025 under the leadership of my dear colleague, the permanent representative of Singapore in New York, Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor. And I wish him and the new working group, a lot of success in their endeavors. As I said, there is still much to do, and it is my hope that states will continue on this path of cooperation and constructive approaches, fulfilling our shared desire for a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace, meeting the expectations of the many out there suffering from malicious use of ICTs. Thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador, for joining us in real time, and thank you for gracing our forum with your words. Thank you once again. And ladies and gentlemen, next, we would like to have the second keynote speech. Next, please allow me to introduce Mr. Vint Cerf, Vice President of Google. So he was not able to be here in person, so he has sent us very meaningful video. So let's get our attention to the screen with a big round of applause.
Hello, my name is Vint Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. I wish I could be there in person, but my calendar didn't cooperate, so you'll have to put up with virtual Vint. The topic is security, and writ large, of course, it's an enormous subject, one which I can only touch on a small element of in this short introduction. But I would like to start out with a little discussion about zero trust, something which Google is one of the earliest proponents of this notion, which is basically that it doesn't matter how you got to a particular server, it doesn't matter what network you were on, you do not inherit any trust based on the network you're connected to, including, for example, the corporate network, for example. We are assuming that you have to supply bona fides before any of the receiving servers should trust you or to offer you any kind of authority or access to services and information. So zero trust is a very important concept. It basically means that you have to show up with bona fides that the serving party can validate. Sometimes that amounts to a certificate issued by a certificate authority, which associates you with a public key, and you can prove that you still have the public key by doing an exchange involving your private key. That's one possible tactic. Another possible tactic is that you have a hardware token that allows you to demonstrate that you have the bona fides that identify you and associate you with that particular cryptographic token. Sometimes we use usernames, passwords, and a second authenticating mechanism, two-factor authentication. All of those are indicators of zero trust, where you don't get trusted at all until you can authenticate yourself adequately to the server. And in the cloud environment, that's particularly valuable because cloud environments are designed to isolate users from each other, or for that matter, for competitors that might be sharing a common cloud-based service. But they're isolated from each other for good reason. They don't want the competitors to know what they're doing. So the zero trust model reinforced with hardware is extremely important. I want to switch to another topic which has to do with collaboration, because in the internet or online environment, it's often the case that competitors end up cooperating with each other at some level. So as an example, for many of the internet service providers, when there is a denial of service attack underway, or there's some other known malware attack of some kind, it's often the case that even competitors' engineering teams will collaborate with each other in order to identify the source of an attack, or to respond to the exposure of a new attack vector, or information associated with a vulnerability that's been disclosed. And I could not overemphasize the importance of this collaborative attitude. This includes not just competitors that might be sharing common infrastructure, but it also includes law enforcement agencies across international boundaries that need to cooperate in order to identify parties who should be held accountable for their bad behaviors. So this notion of collaboration and cooperation, it seems to me, is a vital element in online environments of the 21st century. Another thing which is worth considering is that cloud-based services have ample ways of improving security. By way of example, whenever there's a change in software that would improve security by remedying a vulnerability, that can be propagated everywhere all at the same time, because all of the users are dependent on the cloud-based infrastructure, as opposed to the more common situation where people are relying on software in a particular client, like a laptop or a pad or a mobile, and everyone individually has to download and upgrade the software. Here, the cloud operator can do that in a wholesale way, meaning that the repairs or the improvements are simultaneously available to everyone, and that's an important property of a cloud-based environment. There are two other things which have come to the surface in the recent past. One of them, of course, is supply chain vulnerability. And here we get into some very interesting and subtle attacks against ecosystems. Perhaps you're a company that uses third-party software, for example, for your point-of-sale systems. If the third party that you buy that software from has been successfully attacked, the software that you're running in your point-of-sale system might actually be compromised and might be copying, every credit card that goes through the point-of-sale system and sending it to a malware hacking collector, who will then make use of those credit cards for nefarious purposes. There's a related problem, and that's with open source. And here we get into the conundrum that open source software is often thought to be more secure because everyone can see the software, and everyone can verify whether it does what it's supposed to do. The problem is that since everyone assumes everyone else has done it, sometimes the open source libraries are actually more buggy than, say, proprietary code might be, which suggests to me at least two things. One of them is that you should be very careful with open source software to scrutinize it and make sure it's doing what you expect it to do. And the second thing might be that we should mount a wholesale effort to evaluate the most frequently used open source software for bugs and vulnerabilities, because I think that might be in everyone's interest. There's a third problem associated with open source, and it's another supply chain style attack. If someone has modified the compilers to produce extra code that wasn't part of the source code, then you'll never know by looking at the source code that, in fact, the compiled code has a hidden piece of malware in it. And so that's another kind of very subtle supply chain attack. Well, all of these things are just part of the much bigger mountain of concerns for safety and security and privacy in online environments. And this simply reminds us that we have a lot of work to do if we want to make our users feel and actually be safe in the online internet. Well, thanks for listening. I hope that you have a very productive meeting, and I look forward to hearing useful insights and outcomes from the conference. Meanwhile, see you on the net.
Vice President, we'd like to extend our sincere gratitude for sharing your meaningful words and, of course, insights as well. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, now we'd like to continue with our panel discussion session. So on the stage, we're joined by Ms. Joyce Hackman, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House and co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy, who will lead a session today as a chairperson. And we're also joined by Mr. Jeff Mills, founder of DEFCON. Thank you once again for your time and your attendance. And we are also joined by Mr. Anton Singarev, Vice President of Yandex, Russia's largest internet portal, who is joining us online in real time as well. Thank you for your time. So, ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to pass over my microphone to our chairperson. So if you're ready, the floor is yours. And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome her with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the Republic of Korea for the invitation to this forum on world emerging security issues. I'm very pleased to be part of this initiative, especially given the importance of having and bringing these debates and conversations into this region and into other regions around the world as well. As we have heard, this session is focusing on the role of international cooperation in achieving a safe and peaceful cyberspace. And I would also add to that a prosperous cyberspace, one that protects civil liberties, human rights online, while enabling innovation and enabling digital technologies to play their role as catalysts for socioeconomic development. For quite some time, the discourse around countries cooperating with one another to ensure stability in cyberspace has been rather a discouraging one, where it was often talked about the divergence of views and the inherently different ideological approaches to cyberspace governance, and how that meant that progress was difficult to be achieved. But this year, as we've heard from Ambassador Lauber, has given us a slightly different narrative and has been quite instrumental in actually showing that states can indeed come together and can reach a consensus. Two global governance processes devoted to cyber stability at the United Nations, the Open-Ended Working Group and the Group of Governmental Experts, GGE, were born from two competing UN resolutions, the former sponsored by the Russian Federation and the latter by the United States. But they were able to agree to consensus reports that were compatible. In part, the success of the two processes was due to all states, even if they opposed one or the other resolution, to fully engage and negotiate in good faith in each venue. And as Ambassador Lauber mentioned, this shows that there is a greater understanding of how urgent the issue is and the importance of compromise and the desire for international cooperation to address the threats in cyberspace. So that is good progress. But one of the important questions is, where do we go from here? And how can we ensure that this consensus is translated into concrete actions, leading to a positive impact on how states behave responsibly in cyberspace? But ensuring a safe and prosperous cyberspace is not just the job of states. And we will hopefully discuss today why it isn't. We have heard from Vint Cerf some concrete examples for how the private sector can come together, not only in identifying the sources of certain cyber attacks and responding to them, but also in raising awareness on the latest cybersecurity issues and the concerns for safety, security, and privacy that we should all be trying to address. Other stakeholders, such as civil society organizations, the academia, and the media, and more, have a very important role to play as well. So each one of these actors, while having different roles, can be brought together to complement each other and can help create a better ecosystem for collaboration between them at various different levels in a way that would help achieving stability and prosperity in cyberspace. But to get there, there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome. So today, we want to talk about this with the hope of identifying some concrete actions for how this could happen and for how cooperation between different actors can be enhanced. And to do that, as Jessica mentioned, we have excellent panelists with us today, in addition to Ambassador Lauber, Jeff Moss, and Anton. So welcome to the panel, all of you. And perhaps I'd like to start with a question to you, Jeff, as a computer and internet security expert, who have a certain way for approaching this issue particularly. I'm interested in hearing more about what do you think are the main, or is the main challenge impeding global cooperation on cyber stability?
Oh, on cyber stability? So I think there's really the two large groups, right? There's a government with a regulatory authority, and you have hacking, security, academic groups. And they have sort of influence, or they have control of the infrastructure, the technology. They're the Apples, the Googles of the world. And there's a tension between that civil society component and the regulatory governmental focus. And most of the issues we see is kind of expressed as that tension. And so I always like to point out that the security community do things that the governments and companies can't do. So for example, let's say you're a consumer and you want to purchase a lock, a physical lock, and you don't know what lock to buy. Well, every company will tell you that their lock is the best lock, and they're not going to tell you the problems with their lock. And governments aren't going to tell you what the best lock to purchase is either, because then maybe they're taking sides. So and the criminals who know how to break into the locks, they're not going to tell you either. So how do you find out what the best lock is? It's hackers and security researchers, academics, that actually take apart the locks and tell you this lock is good, this lock is bad. So anytime I hear about regulations that are going to stifle researchers, to me that's a red flag. Something's wrong with that society or that country. So for example, in the United States, there's very robust public disclosure around vulnerabilities. There's been recent expansion of the DMCA, allowing researchers to hack more than just medical or automotive and voting systems. So we're gaining more ability to tear apart critical systems and find vulnerabilities. Where in China, recently, there's been a security crackdown where researchers have to actually turn over their vulnerabilities to the government first before they can go public. And I just use that as an illustration of the two ways of looking at the same problem. It's like two different lenses. And so I think somewhere in the middle there, you have that civil society that is trying to provide sort of collective defense, like you mentioned, right? Vint mentioned you can be a competitor, but you both rely on that critical infrastructure. And I was just recently a member of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, and our core finding was to protect the core of the internet. If there are norms and rules of the road, the core of the internet, routing, naming, should be off limits. Right? It's a collective shared resource, and that was sort of the uniform agreement. And hopefully that will make it into these norms that you heard, the GGE, OWG, other groups. And so I think we, government and private sector, support each other, but don't confuse one for the other.
So you talked about this tension between government and civil society, private sector, the security community. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And do you see a certain progress in the relationship between the two? Or is it stuck somewhere? And it will always remain like that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So for example, companies, civil society, engineers want to solve the problem. And they get really frustrated when the problem can't be solved or the government doesn't seem to be helping. So for example, a couple of years ago, there was a big case, again in the United States, where Apple was told by the FBI to turn over some encryption keys so they could unlock a phone. And Apple said no. Because if they did that, every country in the world would ask for the ability, and pretty soon they would have no privacy on any of their products, and their iPhone would become, would lose market share. So what does Apple do? They engineer themselves out of the problem. If a government tries to impose too many restrictions, it might be cheaper for the company to avoid the problem entirely by just engineering out of it. So for example, there's this messenger called Signal. From the ground up, Signal, the messenger, was designed to be to avoid all of the government requests for information. So now when the FBI asks Signal for data, they can honestly say, we don't have any. So when I talk about that tension, I'm saying if the governments apply too much attention, too much pressure, the companies will just engineer themselves out of the problem, and then the governments will get nothing. On the other hand, companies need the help of governments. For example, in ransomware, our most recent problem, if governments can say to companies and individuals, it's not legal to pay a ransom, you'll starve the ransomware groups of money. And if the government say, no, it's legal to pay ransom, pay blackmail, you'll fuel the creation of a whole new industry that exists to make sure ransomware continues. You'll have lawyers, you'll have negotiators to negotiate ransomware payments, you'll have cryptocurrency brokers, you'll have more providers. And we're at that point where we need the government to step up and say, you know, this is a power you have that the civil society doesn't. Please restrict the sale, or please restrict people from paying ransom. Otherwise, we'll create a greater harm. And I think there's very few situations where both are equal.
It's quite interesting, the examples that you've given us, and really showcasing that it's no longer an option to kind of keep these conversations separate and for these two communities not to engage with one another.
I think, one quick comment, I think what's happened in the last 5 years, technologists have avoided politics because it's dangerous and they don't understand it, and they've made fun of politicians who also don't understand technology. And they both existed in their own world, but not anymore. The stakes are too high, and the technologists have to pay attention and get involved in politics. And the politicians today have grown up with technology, and they understand it better than ever before. So it's harder to tell the politician, no, you don't understand.
Yeah. In some countries anyway, not everywhere. But Jeff, I wanted to ask you before I turn to Ambassador and then Anton about, we've been talking about the OEWG, GG, and perhaps you're an exception, having participated in the Global Commission as a kind of a computer security researcher. How much do you think the security community takes notice of those diplomatic efforts? How much do they know about this consensus, the open-ended?
Yeah, they don't pay attention very much. Again, it's not something. So, for example, in the GCSE Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace, we're talking about norms that might take 10 years to be adopted. And technologists are shipping code in 2 months. And they're two completely different time scales. So the reason I participate is I have to do things on a very short scale, and thinking a longer term on norms is a nice counterbalance. But a lot of people don't have that luxury. I was the chief security officer at ICANN. That's what sucked me into this whole multi-stakeholder model vortex. But there's not like 10 ICANNs, there's one. And so there's very limited opportunity for technologists to get involved into IETF or GCSE. It's not many opportunities.
Right. So we need more of those opportunities, I guess. Ambassador Lauber, how can we improve this relationship and this exchange between the different communities? I mean, we're talking about technologists, but there are all sorts of other communities as well that have an important role to play. And yourself, pioneered the information, the intersessional meeting where, non-state actors were able to come to the UN and talk about how they think the issues should be approached. So how do we, enhance this? And just, looking maybe particularly at the internet security experts, how do you think can they help diplomats develop policies that are fit for purpose?
Thank you much, Joyce. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and I don't have any answers that will solve the problem right away. But I think the approaches we've been taking, or we've seen also over the last 2 years plus, are at least encouraging. I completely agree with Jeff when he says that the two roles are, we need to respect also the difference between the two roles. Governments have a distinct responsibility and private sector has a distinct role, but we can't keep ignoring each other. I also feel that the call from private sector for norms on global, regional, national level has increased since I've been involved in this issue. In the beginning, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to get involved, even in discussions with the government side, with the legislative side, because this fear of interference. And meanwhile, I think even tech companies realize we need some framework, otherwise their business model is put into question. So how to build these bridges? I think it's just showing good examples. It needs a couple of people on either side who have the vision of bringing these different groups together and then try some models. We had this within the open-ended working group. We had this one big event, I can't even remember, 2 or 3 days intersessional multi-stakeholder event in New York, and it has largely been organized by actually the colleagues from the UN Secretariat. And I have to say, in my long career now as a diplomat, I think this is the best event I've ever participated in, where representatives from civil society, I mean, traditional NGOs, academia, private sector, and government were in one room and discussed the same issues and even had some interactive discussion among themselves. But this needed a lot of preparation, and it needed careful selection also of who should be in the room. And this was not, I don't mean that private sector or civil society representatives have to be, exclusively selected or handpicked in a sense that it would be exclusive. It has to be inclusive, but we have to make sure that the right people are there, those who really have to say something, those who are competent to talk to the issue, and at the same time represent different backgrounds, private companies, not just from Europe or the US, but also from other parts of the world, civil society organizations from different kinds, from different regions, etc. It needs a very conscious, very positive effort, and then I think we can improve that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anton, I would like to also get your perspective on this issue. What do you think the main challenge is? And, Ambassador Laub was talking about how important the participation of non-governmental actors was in the open-ended working group, and how there was a lot of support for that. But we also know that a lot of countries are against this participation. They prefer to keep it just for states. So I'd like to get your perspective, and what do you think are the main challenges in sort of reaching stability, and how can we overcome those challenges?
Sorry. Thanks, Joyce. I'm really sorry I couldn't join you in person yet, but it's really hard these days to do in-person meetings. I had an honor to work with Ambassador Laub in OIWG Group as an expert, and now as a representative of a private company of the company. Actually, I have an interesting view on how it actually works. I will take the courage to speak on other companies as well, on behalf of other companies. We actually don't want to be in a perfect world. We don't want to be in this dialogue, because we run our businesses, we run our services for our customers, and this is our main goal. But surprisingly, we found ourselves being in the middle of these political talks, because our companies grew. Now we provide services for billions of people. Google provides services for billions of people. Yandex, it's not just the internet portal. So we do taxi, food delivery, cloud services, and many other things. So, and we became too important on the country level, and some companies, international companies, became too important on the global level. And that's why we attract a lot of attention in terms of regulation, and this is natural. So now we found out ourselves in a very weird position. On one hand, the world relies on private companies on a very high scale. For example, we are here talking in Zoom, not in a government-protected, super secret video conference network, but we're using Zoom because it's very convenient, easy, and simple. And the same goes for many other companies. And at the same time, governments are naturally maybe not really happy on being dependent on private companies. But this is the reality of 2021. And now we need to find the balance how, on one hand, be involved in all these cybersecurity talks, international talks, for private companies, and at the same time, to leave the government their role on setting up the rules. Jörg mentioned intersessional events in OLWG process, and indeed, that was a really good way to talk to private companies, but this was a little bit out of the main process. So maybe the opportunity for the next OLWG group, which will start pretty soon, is to have more clear and transparent way of involving private companies. Because we have some work to say. We see some problems and some difficulties in being regulated in many different countries, and I definitely believe that we can contribute, and other companies can contribute.
Thank you, Anton. You talked about, how the new open-ended working group might need to be more open to having participation. I think the modalities have been launched, I think yesterday, by the new chair, and perhaps it's going to be very similar to the previous open-ended working group, but we will see. But I'm interested in your views as to, so we know what the open-ended working group should do, what the states should do, what the UN should do, but what the private sector companies should do as well. Mm-hmm. And, we talk in the previous open-ended working group, if we look at who were the private sector companies that were involved, very few of them were, right? And mostly technology companies. How can we bring this conversation to big companies that are not necessarily technology companies, but extremely important for this conversation, especially given their role as, in the critical national infrastructure? So how can we expand this conversation to more actors on the private sector side?
Well, it's also a question of maturity for companies. Because on the other hand, companies historically also were a little bit out of these talks, and international diplomacy, this is a pretty challenging thing, and not many companies has got experience and understanding how it actually works. This is first thing. Other companies need to be more mature, and this is a natural process. And I guess that the more talks happen and the more information about this talk are on the table, the more companies will involve. And also another important thing is the responsibility of the companies. So Jeff was talking about responsibility, and Jörg was talking about private sector responsibility. And I think we are responsible. Private companies are responsible because we offer services for billions of people. And to some extent, some of the companies may be part of national critical infrastructure. And I'm not talking about energy. I'm talking about daily services. Imagine your daily life when you cannot call taxi, cannot order food, cannot find a way, and you cannot do anything. This is pretty dark future. It may be pretty dark future. So companies are responsible for cybersecurity. Companies are responsible for providing services, and they are responsible in instructing and helping governments to develop modern and convenient cybersecurity regulation.
Same question to you, Jeff. How do you think can we expand this effort to more private sector companies to be involved in this conversation around this stuff like big picture?
Well, yeah, I think there's I think there's a couple of things. One is there's a recognition that these internet problems that we face are global problems. And global problems will require a global solution. And those that are closest to the problem, closest to the levers to fix the problem, have the greatest responsibility to fix the problem. So like Anton was saying, at Yandex, if they're close to a problem and they are uniquely situated to filter or resist the attack or identify the intruders, they have that responsibility. Even if legally they don't have the responsibility, morally they have the responsibility. And so there are some companies out there that are more, I would say, responsible than others. The Microsofts, Facebooks, Googles, Amazons, whatever. They're so large at scale, they bear more responsibility than, say, my teeny little company. So we have to recognize there is sort of market power differences between the players. And you can also see how these players, if they can't get what they want through laws, they have acceptable use policies. They have terms of service. They have peering arrangements with other internet providers. And we see companies flexing those strengths. So for example, when social media got too out of hand after the election, Twitter just uses their terms of service and bans former President Trump, right? So companies have other remedies that they're getting more and more comfortable using. And I think there's a lot of underutilized tools that companies have but are afraid. So for example, one other example is, and this is a question I have for everybody. Why is it that Microsoft is the only company in the world that is offering bounties to find botnet operators? Why isn't IBM and Amazon, and why aren't there 10 companies in France and 20 in Europe? Why isn't the collective response of the private sector to find the botnet operators and shut them down and offer all these bounties and make their life miserable? Why is only one company doing it? I don't have a good answer, but I think there are things that the private sector can do, like offer bounties, like provide intelligence, that would make the environment safer, but they're not for some reason. And I think until we understand why not, we'll always be underperforming.
I think Anton might have an answer to that. You're on mute, Anton.
No pressure, Anton.
Sorry, I'll try to make a guess. Well, probably for Microsoft, it's a business case, because Microsoft is one of the biggest victims because of botnet attacks. Not direct victim, but Microsoft is obviously the most popular operating system on the planet. And thousands of businesses and probably millions of businesses suffered from the botnet. And people do not understand that it's not necessarily Microsoft's fault that they became a victim. So possibly this is a business case for Microsoft, which is actually good, because it helps everybody. It helps all the users around the world. And by the way, Joyce, I wanted to add to my previous remark, sorry, it came to my mind, that possibly the way to engage private companies can be a more transparent and simple way for the companies to be engaged, because not everybody monitors Unidir web page on a daily basis. And the guidelines can be a little bit misleading sometimes. So the more clear and transparent way to be engaged can be the way to invite other companies. Thank you.
Thank you. And on that last point, the sort of accessibility to information and knowing really what's going on, I want to turn to you, Ambassador, as a long-serving UN official, or ambassador to the UN, sorry, I should say. How do you think the UN can become more accessible to organizations and actors who haven't, who necessarily participated or engaged in UN processes before?
Yeah, honestly, I think the UN made great progress, but it depends a bit on the issue you're dealing with. And some issues are traditionally very sensitive, and especially when you discuss security, peace and security issues, when you talk about environmental issues or social issues, the UN has been much more open to participation, multi-stakeholder participation. And what you said before, that some member states are still very reluctant to open the discussion, is of course true. But again, I think it takes the efforts of those who recognize the need to open up the discussion and to bring the different groups together. And it takes efforts and initiatives from all sides. During the process, I always kept inviting civil society and private sector to find their own ways of approaching the intergovernmental discussion. And there are many ways. Let's be creative. You either approach delegations from certain member states, or you organize events that have outcomes, and you find ways of bringing the outcomes into the discussion. There's always a way, but it takes personal initiatives. It takes personal efforts. And listening to the discussion today, even although our group is very small, I'm very optimistic that some people will pick this up. Anton, whom I've known very well from our cooperation in the Open Networking Group, I'm glad to see him now on the other side, so to speak, and drive this effort on.
Thank you. Jeff, we've been focusing on, the initiatives or these sort of global governance processes at the UN, but we also made reference to other existing initiatives, such as the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, that have been initiated by the private sector. I'm interested in your views as to what sort of impact do you think these initiatives have had on this issue, and are they a successful model that should be replicated, invested in, expanded to include other actors?
Yeah, so I think there's, for government, well, first I'll start with the criticism of my own government. I'm really frustrated in the United States where there's not enough participation by the government in a lot of these civil society bodies. So, for example, in the early days, 70s, 80s, 90s, when a lot of the internet infrastructure and protocols were being developed, there was a lot of participation, HP and IBM and Sun Microsoft governments, a lot of participation. And over the years, there's been a lot less participation by governments and departments and agencies and regulators, and to the point where at least a lot of times it seems as if the United States government is not showing up to a lot of these. And so they're being outmaneuvered by other countries that are sending a lot of people. And so I think you have to recognize, if you're a government, that if you're don't have a seat at the table, you're going to be outmaneuvered. There's a reason why all the 5G standards are coming from China. They showed up, they put in the work, they sent the experts. The West did not. And so it's not just a question of debating some trade-off and a norm. There's real economic advantage to participating in some of these bodies. So first off, I think you need to acknowledge that in this technological future we're living in, you have to show up. So, and then to some of the points you mentioned, I see, at least especially from the ICANN days and others, it's a lot of capacity building, I think, and it's a lot of confidence building. You can have conversations and demonstrate technology as a civil society group that you couldn't have representing necessarily a government. And so I think there's another group, Chris Painter, I can't remember the name, the group of the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise, yeah. I think they are going to have a lot of impact in building capacity. And what we find is as countries get more comfortable, so for example, if your country is signing its DNSSEC signing its root cert, you're now in a club of more sophisticated, more secure naming. As you gain capacity, as you get more routing security and you do route filtering, every one of these steps, you're taking that expertise and you're baking it into your infrastructure, and it's making your country a little bit more resilient. And I think that's really the name of the game, is we're trying to build resilient infrastructures through civil cooperation. And the big change has been, the pressure was to optimize for the fastest speed, and that is sort of the opposite of resilient infrastructure. But the financial pressures were to optimize. And what you end up doing is creating fragile infrastructure. And what we're talking about now in a lot of these forums is how we have to be resilient. But there's a cost trade-off there, and we don't ever really talk about the cost. And I think the civil society people and the companies see that and they think, oh my gosh, how much more do I have to pay? And the government will say, we need it to be more resilient, not fully understanding that the cost consequences. And then my final observation in that is that these decisions, a lot of these decisions are being made by engineers. But these decisions have political impact. So for example, if you're optimizing for security, DNSSEC, RPKI, SBGP, you're making the internet more fragile. And the governments are not deciding to be more fragile, and the citizens are not deciding to be more fragile. It's the engineer on his own, because he wants to make the network more secure, is making everything more fragile. And there's not a debate about that trade-off. And that's the way it's always worked. I think going forward, we're going to have to start having some of these debates publicly about how much security for how much fragility.
And I think the standards example is quite an excellent one, especially in particular around the sort of new IP proposals that we've heard of and what impact that might have on the internet and on splintering the internet. Anton, I wanted to get your views on this, and especially given your former role, being engaged in a company that was pioneering some of these sort of public sector initiatives. What sort of impact do you think these initiatives have, and what future do you think awaits?
Yeah, well, in my previous role, we launched one of the projects which in my view became the framework for other companies as well. So there is clear trend on transparency. There is clear trend on explaining how the company works, how the source code works, how the data processing is organized, and so on and so on. And for the cybersecurity industry, which I was representing in past, this was something new. And I need to say that other companies, they kind of following the same approach. And I think the more initiatives like that we have, the better it works for the whole industry. And Jurg mentioned some other initiatives apart from OWG, for example, Periscope, Microsoft initiatives. There are a few of them. Well, it's good that there are a lot of them happening. There is a big movement from France as a government in offering new approaches, and it's good. It's good that the companies begin moving in this kind of self-regulation area, because on one hand there is clear demand on the market by the users, by governments, by the society for more transparency. On the other hand, governments are taking more and more serious approach in terms of regulation. And possibly this can be the way, some kind of self-regulation, or more transparency from the private sector. This definitely can be the solution, which in a positive way impacts the whole global security, and this may be helpful.
Thank you. We have a question from the floor, and maybe I'll ask Ambassador Lauber to maybe start with an answer, and then if you would like to add, please do. So the question is, to enhance awareness of the responsibility of actors in cyberspace, which would be more effective, regulations or punishment?
I'm afraid we have to stick to regulations at this point, because as I tried to say in my little speech, some of the issues are very sensitive, and among the most sensitive are what do we do beyond implementation? How do we get better at implementing the norms we are deciding, and how do we deal with infraction of those norms? This is very complicated due to many factors, not least also geopolitical environment is not very conducive to that. But it has to be done. It has to be addressed. And there again, I think that's one area where there is a clear responsibility of member states. Member states have the responsibility to provide the normative framework. They should listen to other actors while doing so that they come up with norms that are really useful and implementable. But then they have the responsibility to implement. And again, as I don't have the wholesale answer, it's just more efforts, more step-by-step approach.
Thank you. Anton, would you like to add to that? I mean, some people say, it's great that we have the norms, but these at the end, they are non-binding norms. And if there are no consequences, they will remain just like, nice ambitions. What is your take on that?
Well, couple of thoughts. Firstly, it's pretty hard to make norms applicable for the whole world and enforce them unless we have many countries. So it's pretty challenging task. And the second remark is, well, in my view, it's like bringing up your own child. You can punish, you can use a stick, but the history shows that possibly that's not the most efficient way. It works in the short term, but in the long term, that actually makes vice versa. It makes the whole process harder. There is another way, not using a stick, punishment of using talks, explaining how it actually works and bringing up your own child in this way. It's much harder. It needs a lot of patience, takes much more time, but at the end of the day, it's much more efficient. So I would say that norms and self-regulation, transparency is better in the long term than just punish.
Do you agree with that, Jeff?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that in security, there's been a lot of research on incentives. And so maybe not a punishment, but how do you create an incentive model to encourage people to do what you want, right? Use two-factor authentication, maybe your login lasts longer or you get more permissions. You want to force people to do the right thing, but they have to want to do the right thing. And I think norms are a fantastic way to provide transparency or indicators that where the bad actors are. So if a certain country or company is constantly violating the norms, even though maybe legally there's no punishment, the marketplace starts to realize, hey, how come that company or country is constantly violating the norms? I don't think I'm going to do business with them, or I think I'm not going to be as friendly with them. And I think that's the whole role of norms at this point, because they're all soft norms, they're not hard. But if I was at one of these companies building products, I would be focusing on incentive models to try to get people to do the right thing.
Thank you. So we're sort of reaching the end of this session, and I just wanted to maybe ask some questions to think about the future and what should we be working towards. And Ambassador, you mentioned in your opening remarks about, the importance of following or building on the consensus on the progress that has been achieved. And you mentioned this new open-ended working group process that will last for 5 years. What would success look like for this new process? And how likely is it to be achieved? Like, what are your sort of aspirations in concrete terms about what this process might achieve?
Yeah, I don't want to put my colleague, the ambassador of Singapore, on the pressure, but it's probably a diplomat's answer. The process in itself, I think, is worthwhile. We've seen this over the last 2 years. The simple fact that we were able to bring a lot of countries and other stakeholders together addressed one issue: the lack of awareness. The lack of awareness on two points. One is, I think there is still the extent of the impact of ICTs on all parts of our lives, and in particular on peace and security, is, in my opinion, in many parts of the world still underestimated. And these kind of processes allow discussions not just among governments, but also with experts, what we've been talking about for the last half hour, and to make government people and others more aware of what's the situation, what are the risks, but also what are the opportunities, and how can we on a national level, but also together, address these risks or try to find ways of promote the opportunities. That's one. And on the other side, there's also a lack of awareness of norms. Not a lot, to be honest. That's one of the challenges, again, of the UN. Not as many people or as many institutions as we would like were aware of the existing norms, being non-binding, okay, but still being a good guideline for a better result. So if the process continues and if these discussions can take place, and if the UN level discussions are followed up by more discussions and more work on the regional and national level, where it's probably easier to make progress, also finding norms, finding ways of implementing them, I think that in itself is a positive thing. ultimately, I think the success has to be measured by the number of ICT infractions or abuse of ICTs we see. And right now, to be honest, I mentioned it before, it doesn't look great. When these numbers go down, then we have success.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can I ask you, while you have the floor, what role the regional organizations can play in this process? Because you said we need better exchanges, we need to sort of build more awareness or raise more awareness on what's already out there. What role do you think regional organizations can play, especially that you mentioned the consultation that you had with them as part of the OEWG?
Yeah, it was actually the GGE had a mandate to exchange with regional organizations, and the chair of the GGE, my colleague, the Brazilian ambassador, Patriota, took me along to these consultations. And I thought it was extremely useful for me to listen to the discussions. They all vary. If you go to Africa or to Europe or to Asia, it's a little different because they have specific regional challenges, environments, and they have to address it in different ways. So it's very important to have these discussions also in the regions because they are better able to respond to the specificities in that region, to find solutions that are customized to what they really need. And then solutions that are found in one region should be introduced on the global level as proposals, as ideas, as best practices, and can enrich the global level discussion. So I think these discussions should continue in parallel and extremely important.
Thank you. Anton, how can we improve cooperation? What is it that we should be working towards? Ambassador talked about better exchanges between different communities, raising awareness, sort of, taking these global norms and applying them in a national context. You also mentioned before the importance of states putting their views forward on how these norms, how international law applies. What do you think, from your perspective as a private sector actor, should we be working towards for the next period?
Unfortunately, no silver bullet here. I can just agree with everything Ambassador just said. There is just an example from my colleagues with whom I was working in Kaspersky. I don't think the researchers in all private companies, they know about rules and norms and all these things and international law. But at the same time, they do follow them, and they do act as a responsible citizens. So it's a kind of adding to the previous think about how can we enforce it. Other ways to improve cooperation. Well, regional organizations may be really helpful, and there is a good example of Europol and what they do in fight with ransomware. So on a European level, it's really a good working framework, and I guess the same kind of, well, not small initiatives of middle size, involving like 20, 30 different actors. It may be helpful and it may work, because on a global level, it's always hard to launch something huge. But on a regional level, it can be really helpful. And as I said a few times already, this is a little bit more transparency for the international organizations in terms of guidelines and rules for the private companies, how they can cooperate and collaborate and contribute.
Thank you. Jeff.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot lately about if politics and technology are becoming more intertwined, how do we create more on-ramps for hackers and security researchers to get involved in either multilateral, political, because one of the questions I get that I have no good answer for is, this sounds fantastic, how do I get involved? And my answers are like, read UN documents, comment on IETF, draft proposals, go to ICANN meetings. There's not a very good on-ramp system to get civil society involved in any of this. And the same thing is true in conversely. How do I get more politicians involved in understanding some of these complicated technology issues? Again, there's not many good on-ramps at all. And I think the more we can address these exchange of information, the more efficient the whole relationship will be.
So, it's a really a range, isn't it, between simple fixes such as providing information, raising awareness, getting more people involved, and other more complicated matters, more sensitive matters that require maybe persistent engagement over a longer period. So with that, I'd like to bring this session to a close. We've heard a lot of really concrete, I think, messages and recommendations in terms of how cooperation can be really improved between the different actors. But, if we look at where the conversation started, or when the conversation started in the 90s, late 90s, and where we are today, there is definitely quite a lot of progress that has been achieved. Whether in terms of concrete recommendations that states have agreed to, more awareness, more engagement from actors, and really sort of a more proactive conversation. Of course, the situation is far from being ideal, but we are making progress in that direction. And the challenges will always be there, but it's about how us as a community come together and try to, identify and create some, I guess, creative solutions that can help us all. So with that, I'd like to thank the speakers very much for taking part in this panel and for your insights. It has been a fascinating discussion. And thank you all for your questions and for your attention. And I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much for their in-depth talks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And this brings us to the end of the session 2, entitled Cybersecurity. And we will have the last session, which will be session 3, on emerging technologies and security, under the theme of development and use of emerging technologies and international cooperation for peace and security. We're going to start the next session from 7:40 p.m. Korean Standard Time. So, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your short break and please come back by 7:40 p.m. Korean Standard Time. Thank you.